Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to a discussion that's part of a continuing project that we have launched with the Joint Learning Initiative, the Berkeley Center, and the World Faiths Development Dialogue to explore and try to understand the impact of the COVID pandemic on religious communities across the world in all of the many dimensions. I'm Catherine Marshall, sitting in Washington. I'm at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University and the World Faiths Development Dialogue. We are setting out today to explore through what we call the gender lens, the different aspects of the impact that the crisis is having and will have, particularly on women, but also more broadly, again, through a gender lens. To give you a very practical set of guidance, the session is being recorded. The recording will be sent to those who signed up and will be posted on the Berkeley Center website, also I think the JLI website. We have a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Very much welcome your comments and questions. We see this as a continuing discussion. It's clearly part of many discussions that are taking place now in this Women's Month and at the time that the Commission on the Status of Women has also been meeting. But we bring the particular dimension of asking how is the ethical and how is the religious framework shaping the way we define issues, and I think above all, the way we look at solutions and the path forward. So we have 5 panelists, and what we will do today is to have a conversation. I'll give them each a chance to open with a brief comment, then we'll have another round of questions, and hopefully then we will start to look at the questions and challenges that you raise. Let me start with Kirsten Muth, who is the Executive Director of the Joint Learning Initiative, who has been working on these issues, as has almost everyone on this call, for a long time. But this is a time when we look back to the Beijing conference and to the challenges that were put there on women, and the challenges actually that were part of both the Cairo in the year before and the Beijing conference, challenges that came directly and indirectly on women's roles, some of them with a religious dimension. So how do you see where we stand now, looking back, but also looking forward? Kirsten, over to you. Mute.
Thanks, Catherine. I'd start off by saying that when I first entered the field of working with gender, I started off gravitating or being pulled into the conversation on SGBV, or sexual and gender-based violence. And, which is I start off by saying that we tend to look at slices of the problem, particular slices. And when we look at SGBV, then we look at gender-based violence, then we look at the whole of the family and the whole of the community. So when you really back up to it, I think the really key importance of the religious aspect of this is the fact that religions look at, they speak to and they minister to families and communities. And I think what we've seen over the past, this past year is just really the incredible ability to adapt and to immediately respond and to redirect on just immediately in a way that I think other mechanisms couldn't. And in fact, shut down. We saw a reduction in safe shelters closing, lower access to healthcare for women. As all the health responses pivoted to COVID, there was a real reduction in care for women seeking reproductive health and all of those things. I think that, one of the things that from the JLI perspective, over the last 2 years, we've produced 2 key reports. One is by Dr. Nora Khalif-Elledge, which is looking back to look forward. And that looks at what's happened since Beijing. I want to highlight one aspect of that report, which is a focus on religious literacy. And having having joined JLI at the same moment that COVID was unrolling, I've had to sort of have been water skiing with one foot on learning JLI and the other foot learning COVID. And it's been really, it's been really interesting because I think COVID has really shifted how we do our work. It's really kind of, in some ways, it's advanced the localization agenda, which I think is very good. But key in her report is a focus on faith literacy. And I think that faith literacy, and having sat in on a number of sort of high-level multilateral conversations, it's so glaringly apparent to me how genericized we are when we talk about religion. And the other point I want to make is how segregated it is. I continue to see sort of faith engagement conversations with faith actors. Why are not faith actors just part of the larger conversation? Why are we not in meetings with journalists, with public health people, with epidemiologists, with the anti-racism? Then there's a whole intersectional piece coming out of the UNCSW. My head has a lot of things swimming around in it right now. So one of the other key issues for me right now is the intersectionalism. We keep talking about COVID, but let's not forget that this past year was also a big, huge anti-racism movement coming up, and those things very strongly intersect. So I think sometimes for JLI, we're very much focused on that as well. The second report was, which actually was earlier than the first, was recommendations for a strategic research agenda. And the thing I want to highlight out of that one is that we have really not developed a good way to really research faith and gender. We really lack a validated scale. We do not have the kinds of tools. And so there's a need to develop better tools to really explain the causality and what's actually happening with faith and religion. And the final comment I'll make to that is that because of those above 2 previous things that I mentioned, there's a real lack of understanding and a real lack of an ability to continually ask the right questions, the contextual questions, the need to really dig into the grassroots. And I'll close by saying, and I could go on and on. I wrote so many ideas down before I came to this meeting. But when we talk about gender violence, we tend to look for designing solutions. This problem has been around since the beginning of mankind. And I'm not sure that it's not going to have any one particular solution. And when we come back later, I want to talk about some specific faith facets that I think sometimes get left out of the GBV conversations and in COVID. Because COVID, in effect, didn't change gender dynamics. It just amplified them, as all crises are not gender neutral. But I just lost my thought.
Well, why don't we come back?
I have a lot of thoughts, Catherine, on this.
Because you've put a lot of issues on the table. I think this question of the segregation is one of our main concerns. And clearly the local versus global is playing out in spades. And then this question of how you link all the different elements and how we ask better questions. And with that, I will turn to my colleague, Sarah Thompson, who's working particularly with a focus now on Bangladesh and doing a lot of work on gender-based violence. And I think trying to ask those questions of what is it that's causing the increase? And of course, what do we know and what do we not know? So Sarah, I guess one of the questions is, how do you see the religious communities involved in this, in the Bangladesh setting or beyond, if you wish? Mute.
Been doing this for a year and still need to be reminded to unmute. Thank you, Catherine. Like she mentioned, I'm the project manager for Bangladesh at WFDD, and I'm working with Catherine on a project focusing on development and social cohesion in Bangladesh through a faith lens. And we're currently researching the gendered effects of COVID-19 in Bangladesh with our team in Dhaka at Brack University. And we're specifically looking at the rise of domestic violence, rape, and early marriage. And these, of course, have been problems that have been around, as Kirsten said, since the beginning of mankind, and they've been a persistent problem in Bangladesh, and they've only been exacerbated through the pandemic, as crises usually tend to do. And we know this because our university, a faction of it, has documented that there's been almost 70% rise in reported incidences of GBV in last spring as compared to 2019. And then there was lots of reports made their way to the media about an uptick in gang rapes in early fall 2020 that drove many Bangladeshi women to the streets to protest and demand change. And while Bangladesh is a Muslim majority country, we're looking at ways in which all major faith actors there can be engaged to speak out against various forms of GBV. But specifically to answer Catherine's question, currently, a lot of the data on GBV lacks a significant faith lens, and often many strategies rarely offer actionable ways in which faith leaders and faith communities can act. And they're very well trusted and well respected in communities worldwide, especially in Bangladesh, and they hold a lot of influence. So it's important to engage them, especially when it comes to government officials, secular NGOs, large development organizations, to reach out to these faith actors and forge partnerships to combat violence against women, specifically child marriage, rape. And they can do that through speaking out in sermons, through scripture, and then, condemning these violent acts publicly. But it's also really important to highlight that the faith leaders and religion throughout time have either knowingly or unknowingly perpetuated this gender inequality and these forms of violence through silence on the matter, through scripture, officiating child marriages, even though they're technically illegal in Bangladesh under the age of 18, and also, recognizing domestic violence as a private family matter. So recognizing that these things exist and trying to uncover the underlying patriarchal motivations that exist within all major world faiths is a really important step in working together to create really positive and concrete solutions to engage these faith actors to combat GBV and be allies of women.
I think you've put very, very clearly and with some granular texture, the complexity of the positive side of the levels of trust and the essential links to people's ethical beliefs, but also some of the legacies, let's put it this way, of the past. Sophia Farian is in the education world, very specifically. She's a master's student in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And education is one of the areas that we're particularly concerned about. Clearly, one of the things we worry about, and I'm sure this doesn't apply to you, is that when girls drop out of school during crises, they rarely come back. But I think it would be interesting, how do you see the conversations happening in your cohort in Georgetown? What is the COVID impact, and what might be the things you talk about openly, but also the things that you worry about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Professor Marshall. As was said, and as everyone I'm sure is aware of, COVID has obviously drastically affected the graduate student and just student experience in general and the educational system. I think that one of the things that my cohort and I talk about, and I talk about with my friends, is how we are at a critical moment where we have the opportunity not only to come out of COVID having survived, but the opportunity to make deep systemic change in that we can kind of completely rebuild systems that exist across all sectors. And so that's one thing. I think that everybody is very downtrodden in the sense that grad school is as hard already as it is. Imagine it in a global pandemic. without the support system of your peers in person. But there is a sense of solidarity there's something connecting the classes of 2020 to 2022. We have a deeply rooted sense of empathy for us as future leaders coming into this world, coming into the tables and rooms where we will be the agents of positive change on all the issues that have been spoken about by Tristan and Sarah, and will be spoken about by later in this talk. So that is something we've mentioned, but in terms of my personal experience and so I'm also co-president of the Georgetown Women in International Affairs group, and a conversation that my peers and I have, the members in this group have, is a lot about what are we graduating with or without? You know, we are trained across the world. There are programs that focus on international relations and on any of the international topics. And we want to be prepared. We came to these programs to gain these tools to walk into a room and not just be, from the female perspective, from the women's perspective in particular, not just be a seat at the table, but actually have our hands in the pie of making this change. And there's Zoom discussions are not the same as in-person discussions. Having the space of a classroom, and I know I'm speaking from a very graduate school perspective, but having the space in a classroom to practice and make mistakes, to practice conflict resolution, to practice peace-building negotiations with the support of our professors and our peers in a natural conversation. It's difficult to do when the person you're trying to just like talk to has been muted for the past 30 seconds and you missed their first point, you know? And so these skills that we're supposed to be coming out with, they are different, a very different platform. And I think that in terms of the spaces we'll be moving into as change makers, there needs to be an understanding and there needs to be a turning to our talented young women, girl leaders who want to be educated, who want to make change, who want to do things for their community, coming in with skills that are completely different. So this just circles back to the idea that we're at this critical turning point where we have the momentum and, you know, the anxiety and energy to rebuild systems across all sectors.
Thank you. Well, let me turn now to Johan Bergman. Johan is also a master's student in a somewhat different program, the Global Human Development Program. No, you're in MSFS too. Sorry, I made a mistake. But he was in my class on ethics and development recently, which led me to explore with him what kinds of conversations he's part of. It's the same question that I asked Sophia, but particularly colored by the Me Too movement, and in too much of the development world by concerns about harassment. We're not talking here about violence, but about harassment, demeaning behavior. But sitting in this discussion about gender lens, we know that men have a fairly large part in this. And maybe you can help us to put what are the questions that you have in your mind about how to address this in a more human, in a more ethical, in a more compassionate way.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, I'm very honored to be here with you all. And I wanted to start by sharing something that I learned from my mother, who was a feminist activist in Sweden. And it might be silly in a secular society like Sweden, but one of the main things that she did that really has stuck with me was to exit the Swedish church. And she didn't do that because they didn't allow female priests, because they did so from 1960, but she did so because when they had allowed female priests, this came with a clause saying to all the priests who were then male, saying to them that you shouldn't act against your own will in any way. which in effect meant that the choice that the women, who wanted to become priests were given was a false choice, because the choice was still sitting with the men to decide if they were going to have the ability to get work as priests. And I think for me, this was a really central tenet of what I learned from her, is that we cannot offer false choice together fully, and offer real choice to both men and women and I think, for her, that was being part of both a barbershop group where they were very feminine and a rock band. And it was being, a hardworking teacher and staying home with me for 2 years as a stay-at-home mom. So it was really about that choice. So what I take with me from that into the COVID world is if this gender equality is about providing real choice to women, then the biggest consequence of COVID has been that it's taken away that opportunity to make real choice. And I think in this time of crisis, society has kind of resorted to this fear response, which has made it impossible to think clearly and rationally about what we want the world to look like. But we've fallen back on these retrograde norms, which might come from religion and culture, of what is masculine and what is feminine. And it's pulled us back enormously. For example, I can see many discussions where the COVID pandemic has created a lot of financial insecurity, where in homes, instead of having a discussion, okay, so how do we split this burden of care that's now larger because schools are closed? Instead of having that open discussion, people have just fallen back into a fear response, saying, okay, how can we keep the house, keep the car, and not get on the street? Okay, mom, take care of kids, dad, work. And then, and that's kind of where we still are in this fear response. So as we're moving out of the COVID pandemic, I believe that it's really important for men to return to the rational thought, and for men to ask their female friends and their partners about how this pandemic affected them, and become aware of how the actual burden of care, of gender-based violence, of all these various things that women carry to a much larger degree actually affect their ability to choose what they can do and ultimately shape their lives and shape society. So that's just something I think, as my mind circles around these issues, that's where I go.
Great. Those are very helpful comments. I think this issue of the meaning of freedom and the meaning of choice is very central. Now to another part of Georgetown's ethos, but also its structure. Reverend Ebony Greason is the Protestant chaplain at Georgetown. And I think we would like to hear from you a bit how you see in the ministry. Actually, one of the interesting broad questions that's been raised by the COVID crisis is, should not clerics and religious leaders be seen as essential personnel in the new categorization, which is part of the debate? So I'm wondering, how do you see these issues? What are you hearing, and what are you, I guess, also what are you sensing and concluding about what's happening?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Marshall and Berkeley Center, for the opportunity to be here. As you heard, as was said, I am Ebony Grissom, Protestant chaplain here at Georgetown. Our website describes, on our website, we describe ourselves as a forward-looking, diverse community devoted to social justice, restless inquiry, and respect for each person's individual needs and talents. This self-proclaimed identity highlights several practical issues with which COVID calls us to respond. How do we practice cura personalis when persons are scattered across the country, across the globe? What is one's responsibility to be a Hoya off the hilltop? How do we embody the spirit of Georgetown outside of our front gates? And to the the point of, should clergy be essential personnel in this season? If our people are scattered, then part of the call, I think many of us feel, is to be where our people are. If we can do it in person safely, that would be great. But of course, for most of this time, we've been virtual. COVID exposes or is exposing latent disparities for both students and employees. When we're on campus, we have access to the same resources, but that may change when we return to our prospective homes, particularly for those who make their homes in the margins of society. Hoya's managed myriad challenges, some of which we've already heard, and sometimes we suffer in silence on the hilltop, but it's harder to hide when we have Zoom classes and meetings, many of which require us to have require or strongly encourage having cameras on. So as we heard earlier about intersections, we see this sort of convergence, the intersection of race, socioeconomic class, and health disparities. The university has been doing a good job of trying to provide reliable internet access for people who need them, but we still then struggle with food insecurity and housing stability, especially for students who are away and we're not able to be back on campus. So all this makes me wonder, even when we have our cameras on in a Zoom environment, do we see each other? Do we see the one who we consider or receive as the other? As far as campus ministry is concerned, we try to embody and project meaning, purpose, and belonging. So I am thinking about and asking myself, how do we balance our desire and responsibility to form students spiritually while they are away, potentially engaged in other faith communities or their home churches? How does in loco parentis shift when students return to their parents or other guardians? And what other obstacles maybe impede formation? Certainly we're hearing a lot about engagement or lack of engagement with Zoom fatigue. How long are we willing to worship in the Zoom rectangle? And how do we accompany one another when we're distant, when we're physically distant from each other? With regard to broader religious responses, I've been heartened by the innovation and initiative that many faith communities are displaying in this extended COVID tide, which shows us that despite the church's characteristic inertia, we can change when we must. We are able to pivot. So I would love to think about these things and all the things that my colleagues here have discussed, and I'll save sort of other comments for elaboration for our conversation.
Great. Thank you. Well, all of you have put a whole host of important questions, and I'm going to start on the second round with Kirsten. I think you put a whole range of questions, but let me ask you to zero in a little bit in thinking about what you would like to see. The question that both of us in our professional lives center on, I think there are two. One is to break down some of the segregation that separates both, I think, sectors, sections, we could call them if we want to be intersectional, but also keeping our eye on what may be the most central principle of Catholic social teaching, which is a preferential option for the poor, that Reverend Evany has been referring to, the people on the margins. Do you have any particular thoughts on, as we build back fairer, as we build back greener and better, any pointers on where we should go? Mute.
I'm getting actually worse at forgetting to unmute myself. It's getting worse as the months go on. Couple of thoughts about that. One of the things, I mean, when I'm going to sort of talk at sort of this level and this level, things that can happen at both. The whole reduction of civil society and civic space, I think has been a huge disaster. I mean, we've lost human rights. All of those things have been so greatly reduced across the world that I think re-strengthening that space is a real key factor. Within that, I think there's a couple things I'd like to highlight. When I look at faith actors and when I look at what actually brings change, it's not development organizations by themselves. To a large extent, most of the most significant social change we have seen is led by social movements, and many of them faith-led. And there's a research paper coming out, and I can't cite it yet, that really talks about how so many of those social movements have been faith-inspired or faith-led. And in fact, many of them have had the faith aspect written out of history. And I think we need to kind of re-champion that. Some of them are very well known, the sanctuary movement, but the women's suffrage movement was it was originally born out of church leaders. And it's that the history of that has been very minimalized. So I think investing in social movements, and when I look at, I draw a lot of my ideas and thinking from the Stanford social innovation work. And when I look at when you look at the financial investments in social movements, we're so geared at looking at investing in short-term projects, short-term research, very narrowed questions, that the amount of funding that is invested in what I would call I think it's called trust-inspired funding, to really invest in a process where you're not dictating or determining what impact or results you want to see. You're investing in a movement that has an organic growth to it, and which by definition is grassroots led. I think for me, that is a key space. And we've seen a trajectory of that in the women's with the Me Too. We're seeing a trajectory of that with anti-racism, with the Black Lives Matter. We're seeing that trajectory grow. But when you look at the amount of funding that is given to those organizations versus development and humanitarian work, it is still way too small. I look at the Islamic tradition of giving, which is a 2.5% giving, and then you have the Christian tithing and so on and so forth. Both of those way exceed the amount of money that the philanthropic world invests in social movements. So I think they have something to learn from the faith community in terms of generosity. So that would be one thing, the social movements and the grassroots. The other thing I would mention is kind of rethinking how we value caregiving. How we this marginalization of life-sustaining work, teaching, caring, how we could possibly build an economic infrastructure around that is more than this kind of low-paid volunteer work. And then the third piece I want to talk about is and when I listen to the conversation around this circle, many of you are speaking from your life stories and life experience. Religion is story-based. Our faiths are story-based. And I think those stories are very important. And when I look at how gender work is, there's the survivors and the perpetrators. In the religious communities, we deal with families and communities. They're holistic. And so creating safe spaces, I was a part of something called the We Will Speak Out movement some years ago, and they commissioned a study with Harvard to look at what was happening in terms of having religious leaders in the Boston area. This was interfaith. And what they found is that it's not that they weren't aware of the issue, they didn't know how to talk about it. They were ill-equipped to talk about it. They were afraid to talk about it for fear of fracturing their communities and their congregations. And I think we need to sometimes revisit the concepts in our faith that talk about restoration and redemption. We can't I know when I had a program funded by a certain UN agency and I talked about working with perpetrators, it would just created a hue and a cry. They're just bad. And I keep thinking, yes, they did bad things, but they are fathers, they are priests, they are imams, and you can't make it so binary. You have to. So I want to mention one thing when we talk about speaking into gender, and that is looking at trauma and how trauma, the cycles of trauma a trauma that is not transformed will be transferred. And here I would refer to some of the work that the Eastern Mennonite University has done on community-based responses to trauma awareness and recovery. And I mention this just quickly because I think there are so many facets to faith that are not being talked about in terms of gender work. And I'll finally close on, when you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, there was no way any court was going to be big enough to handle all of the criminals. And so they had to invent another mechanism for restoring and redeeming what was happening in those countries. And that was faith-inspired, starting in South Africa with Archbishop Tutu. So I just mentioned those things. I think we have to look at trauma. We talk about child marriage, ending child marriage. Well, if you're a refugee family in Syria, you may feel like you have to have a child marriage to secure the food security and the safety of one of your children. And so it is never as simple as this is bad and you can't do this. It's never that simple. And I think that some of the faith components, we need to speak to that more clearly with our faith voice and stop trying to be an orange instead of an apple. So I'll just close with that.
So it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. It's a messy space and we have to be comfortable with that messy space.
So Sarah, I'm going to challenge you with one of the questions that came up in the earlier discussion, which is essentially, what do we know and what do we not know? And if you had a magical wand and could know more about, say, child marriage in Bangladesh, what is it that we need to know, including on some of these somewhat more complicated issues of why this is happening, why this is increasing in the COVID pandemic? And if you had your druthers, how would some of the religious communities deal with that? And you can go more broadly than Bangladesh if you wish, but you've been immersed in Bangladesh, and it's a big and important country. So there's a lot to discuss there.
Sure, as Kirsten just mentioned, it is very complex for the reasons why parents agree to, child marriages for their children. In Bangladesh specifically, it is a protection mechanism. It's a protection, for their honor, for their virginities, against sexual harassment. They figure, if she's married, at least there's a man to make sure she's safe. And then another reason is food insecurity. It's another mouth they can't feed, especially during economic and social crisis. So, yeah, I think extending, grace to these families and having a nuanced perspective on why they do it. And then looking at the other side of, I think, a big fact to drive home about that is how it affects the economics of the country. I mean, child marriage, really impacts the GDP because these girls are in the workforce. They're leaving school early, they're getting married early, and statistics show the earlier a girl is married, she's more likely to face violence from her partner. So that's something that's really been illuminated. And, even though it's technically illegal and there's some loopholes if the girl is 16, in Bangladesh it is illegal, but they're still number 4 in the world for the rate of child marriages. And I think, faith leaders and faith-based organizations and communities can do a lot to combat that and see the root reasons why these girls are being married off earlier. But one thing that Catherine and I've talked about a lot is the reticence among secular feminist advocates and organizations in working with faith-based organizations and faith leaders. And also on the flip side, some faith leaders are hesitant and distrustful with working with secular organizations. There's a fear of it being Western feminism, imperialism, and then, the feminist activists and some of the secular NGOs see that, some religious leaders and organizations are backwards. They don't understand. There have been plenty of times for them to help and speak out and be allies of women, but they haven't. So that's been really interesting to research and see how some of those gaps are being filled. And even when we were doing our virtual qualitative research, we did speak to some legal advocates who were women who had no interest in working with faith groups. And then, some faith groups I spoke to were a little hesitant to work with feminist groups. So that's really interesting. I'd like to know a little bit more about that and how they can come together for the end goal being let's combat this violence and let's uncover why it's mostly men who are the violators.
Good questions and good comments. This question, it is something that is particularly apparent in the relationships between religious and non-religious organizations, is the unease at dealing with a lot of gender issues. And it is partly the diversity within religious communities, but also the perceptions that people have of the other. Sophia, you focused quite a bit on leadership, which I think is an important question. I think it's a little hard to pin down sometimes what to do about it. But I'm interested, sort of echoing your comments earlier, how would you see some of the Georgetown programs, the academic programs, change? And then maybe later Reverend Ebony can help us with some of the divisions and the people at the margin. But if you look at it mainly from the academic perspective, what is missing that the COVID crisis has highlighted, perhaps, is the way to put it?
Sure, thank you. The Georgetown community has been, so the reason I chose to come to Georgetown and to the Masters of Foreign Science program is because I could, from virtual tours, from pamphlets, see a deeply rooted sense in community. And I think that very much stems from the Jesuit tradition upon which this university was founded on, and the Walsh School of Foreign Service in particular. I do think that, as everyone has said, COVID has exacerbated existing disparities. And tying back to leadership, as you mentioned, I think that through a virtual environment that we've been living through and learning through, there is all of the progress that has been done to amplify women's voices and to amplify spaces for marginalized voices. And it has been difficult. I mean, when you're on Zoom, you can't read body language. It's easier to be talked over. And this is something actually that my group, the GUIA group, Georgetown Women in International Affairs, we talk about this a lot, about how do you deal with being in a breakout room with someone, and then when you're in plenary, your male colleague takes your idea without crediting you. It's a very hard thing to navigate in person, but with the Zoom walls, it has been definitely exacerbated in terms of that. But another thing that I think Georgetown, and at least my peers, have really been highlighted by COVID is the need for intersectionality, which has been mentioned a number of times by my fellow speakers today. The need for intersectionality and the need for gender mainstreaming, in the sense that when we discuss any issue, gender is a component that affects it. And gender is not synonymous with women. That's something that I think needs to definitely get modified in every society. Gender is men, gender is women, gender is the entire gender spectrum and every kind of intersectional identity that comes into it. Because when you say you're a woman, that's thousands of different iterations of what layers onto that. So what has been brought up a lot is we've had, for the MSFS program in particular, there was an audit of all the syllabi of our programs to see how many male authors versus female authors, how many people of color, women of color, men of color are the authors on the syllabus. How often do you speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do you include gender mainstreaming in every policy memo or in just every issue? And that is something that at least I know I have sought in my classes, and there's a desire for that. So I think that the intersectionality moving forward, equipping not just female leaders, but also our allies across the entire spectrum to go into these spaces that will make global change and have that critical idea of nothing is black and white.
I'm not seeing any questions yet, but don't hesitate. And also, let's be very clear, this is a continuing conversation that, as you see, all of us are quite passionate about. Let me turn to Johan again, and let's try to think constructively about the future. I think what Sophia is talking about in these questions of bringing together these different threads that are really the essence of the challenge that we're facing of diversity and inclusion. I mean, that's part of it. And one way to look at it is, what are we learning from this extraordinary shared experience of the COVID pandemic? But of course, a lot of it has been there for a long time. It's just more visible. As someone said, revelation is removing the veil from something that was there. Now, one of the questions I guess I could put to you, apart from if you had the route to more comfortable or maybe more fulfilling, maybe we don't want to be comfortable, but we do want to be constructive. Looking at some of these ethical issues that border on the religious, what ideas do you have? What might you do to take us forward?
Thank you so much, Professor. So I think some of these themes that have been brought up during this last round are crucially important to this question. I think the idea of civil society and culture, critically important. I think the idea of engaging the perpetrators, and I don't mean perpetrators in the sense that you have to be a perpetrator of rape, but you are in some sense as a man a perpetrator of upholding the gender inequality situation, whether you want it or not. And then also adding to that cultural civil society side, adding the religious side, because both religion and culture come with incredibly heavy norms that they place on women and men with different lenses. I was listening this morning to a podcast where Barack Obama is talking to Bruce Springsteen. They talked about, it's called Renegades. They talked about how the culture in the US specifically forms how men should be, and how difficult it can be to not conform with that idea of being domineering, excelling in sports, and want to fight, want to make money, and do all these things. And I very much recognize that also in Sweden, although we're the third most equal country. There's still a lot of that challenge that's there, but we have to some extent achieved progress because leaders and civil society have kept the discussion about gender, about equality in the public space for over 100 years. And it has forced society and people to look at themselves and understand, how am I and my perception of myself informed by the social and cultural norms that the society that I've grown up in? And in turn, what are the stories that I tell myself about what I should be like based on those norms? And in Sweden, that's a very equal country. That's still a problem. Then I also lived in Pakistan for a while. It's, funnily, I looked it up today. It's the third least gender equal country. And there, this movement is getting started, but there is, as opposed to Sweden, a very, very pronounced religious normative lens or framework on top of that too. That just, in the Aurat March, which they had on International Women's Day, there were, I think, 2 petitions, legal petitions to the state court of banning this because it's an anti-Islamic movement. And so we're at very different stages of the journey, but I think the challenge remains for us as men in particular, who are upholding this willingly or not, to challenge ourselves to understand what the norms that we live in have made us do and continue to make us do, which may or may not be you know, out of will to not lift women up. We might want to help create gender equality, but you know, subconsciously we work against it. So really having a reckoning with our own norms. And I think in the context of an educational curriculum, I think the course like the one that you had just now, Professor Marshall, in ethics, courses in leadership that we have taken really force you, if you're serious about them, to look at your norms, to look at your story. And I think those types of courses should be prolonged at a lower intensity, ungraded, so that they run alongside any other topics, just going back to Sophia's point about intersectionality, so that there is a continuous engagement with these questions parallel to other topics as well.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're coming closer to the end and the questions are pouring in, but I do want to go back to Reverend Ebony. I was very moved by your comments about the dilemmas that we face in terms of unequal opportunities within this Georgetown University community, which is in many ways a very privileged community. And I think also you're very conscious of the difficulties that people are alluding to and that is coming up in some of the questions about how to have conversations where there seem to be third rails, that people seem to be so uncomfortable. That's obviously a much larger issue in the society, but I'm bringing it back to the topics that we're talking about today. What might you offer as advice on how we do better in thinking and dealing with these issues?
Thank you. That's this. I feel that's the spirit running, because I was actually thinking of something along those lines after listening to my colleagues. Part of, I think, what's getting at the heart of the third rail, certainly with regard to the church, and big church, big C, church universal, and faith communities, but certainly speaking as a Christian, part of our difficulty is because, generally speaking, the church has been complicit in marginalizing women, including, silencing women and people of color, especially in the United, certainly speaking from a context in the United States. The church, I think, is still wrestling with how to make this right, how we repair the breach, whether to repair, is this actually a breach or is it a right read of scripture? So we, wrestle with questions of interpretation. I think the church certainly has a role to play in repair. I'm thinking about what Kristen shared earlier, restoration and redemption, that for sure, but first comes repentance. And those of us who are Christian in this season of Lent are especially mindful and prayerfully practicing, embodying repentance, that sense of turning around, making, you're going in one direction, that's not the way to go. And so you make a change. How ideally the church would model that for our culture, and that would, extend all across into government, into NGOs, into schools and other settings. But we have some work to do ourselves regarding what is right, and how we see the other, and how do we envision the image of God when it's stamped on every person God has created.
Well, that is this vital sense of human rights, but also human dignity. Mm-hmm. The idea in the development field of equity, And how does that translate into reality? Well, we're coming close. We have 5 minutes only, and we have to end on time. I'm going to put one of the 5 questions and see who volunteers to answer it. So everybody get ready as I read it. And then the sort of very quick final comment on what we should do next from each of you. So this is the question from Rachel Fiedler. There are a lot of very rich questions that we need to think about and follow up on, and we will do that. But here's her question. She's interested in the deep limitation that faith-based institutions have in offering evidence-based contributions to gender-based reduction at national levels. I guess she means violence. How do we employ relevant approaches that make sense to government agencies that will make our contribution be included in the overall government progress in dealing with gender-based violence, I presume, especially quantitatively? I think that if I can, I think what I'm reading in that question is that all of a sudden, you know, an issue that was always thought of as somebody else's problem, which was gender-based violence. The reports have shown that it's every society, every income level, every religious community, et cetera. And there's a lot of pretty startling data. That to me, the most moving is that I think half of people who've suffered have never mentioned it to a living soul. So does anyone have a sort of quick answer as to how we communicate this better and therefore engage the religious communities more actively? Kirsten, I see you moving your lips. Mute. Okay.
I wanted to make sure that I unmuted before I spoke this time. Yeah, I think, you know, it kind of comes back to a point I raised earlier. We do not have good standards for measuring faith, religion, and gender right now, and faith and gender. And just from the perspective of our organization, we have a proposal to develop just that, a scale that would be used to validate religion and gender, to look at the kinds of things so that we could do comparative studies, which we're really not able to do right now, which means that most of the evidence is very short-term and organizationally specific. So, but I think even more importantly is how we engage with that evidence. You know, I hear a lot, we need more evidence, we need more evidence. There is a lot of evidence. And the question is, who is the evidence for? Who's it benefiting, and who's using it? And from the perspective of JLI, one of the things that we want to do is diversify that evidence, ask questions that change what the evidence questions that are being asked are, which plays into our focus on racial injustice, because we think a lot of the evidence has been to benefit certain organizations, to feed into northern donor engagements and so on and so forth. And it tends to oversimplify the faith response. So I think we need much more evidence from the grassroots, from practice-based knowledge. And we need to be much more aggressive about creating spaces to debate that evidence, because it's easier to have a debate and to disagree around things when you're talking about something neutral like an evidence report. So I think evidence is a tool. So that would be one of the questions that I would say, but there is a lot of evidence. It's just what questions are we asking, and to whose benefit, and who's engaging with it.
Good. Evidence is an issue. So let's go. Sarah, do you have a last word? Mute.
On that particular topic, I don't, but I'll pass it on to one of my.
Well, no, we're coming to the close. So any specific proposal or idea? You only have half a minute. We're almost at the end.
Well, I'm anxious to put out our paper that, you know, will be based on all the information that we've gathered over the summer. So I'll be sure to send that around when that's ready. So I think that'll be very illuminating.
We'll look specifically at a country case, in this case, Bangladesh.
And add to the literature of GBV and faith-based work.
Sophia, last word?
I'm just very inspired to get the work started as someone who's kind of going to be re-entering the field out of the ivory tower. I'm ready to hit the ground running. Evidence-based research and evaluation monitoring to make sure that we have progress that continues and is maintained.
Great. Johan?
So to complement these strategic evidence ideas, I think also we need to think about the micro level. And I think for men, there are three things we should do. First, it's really understanding what the cultural and religious norms that you live in are. Second, how they inform the stories that you tell yourself about how you should behave. And third, use a lot of the ideas and values that faith can bring us, such as empathy and care and kindness, to talk to our female colleagues, to talk to our spouses and our partners, to understand how their situation is affected by how we behave. And then based on that evidence, again, we can start change on the micro level as well, to work both top down and bottom up.
Reverend Ebony, any last word?
What should we do? Acknowledge, apologize, and repair.
That's a big challenge and an excellent one. I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our hour, but I think that my sense is that we've really begun a conversation that we need to continue about how do we benefit from some of the lessons of the COVID crisis, to put it in very specific terms, whether it is, for example, something we haven't mentioned, that there are higher mortality rates among men than among women. How do we deal with some of the challenges to education? How do we break down some of these barriers between sectors? Somebody mentioned age in a question, ageism. All of these different ways that people have tended to see each other and judge each other so that they don't hear and don't support what that person has to offer. And how do we, because we are approaching this really from ethics, religion, but also the challenge of inequality and inequity in the world, which I think is a theme that unites us all. How do we give the preferential option to the poor? How do we translate that into reality, looking always at the most vulnerable, but also looking at it in the positive spirit of what can be done? So I want to thank you all very much. Thank our audience, who has probably quite frustrated that we didn't get to all your questions, but they're big questions and we need to think about how to address them. So the recording of this will be posted, and we will reflect among ourselves as to how to continue the discussion. So thank you all very much.